Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Strategic Project Management webinar organized by Informa and delivered by Howard Rohm, President and CEO of the Strategy Management Group and Balanced Scorecard Institute, and Wes Balakian, Senior Associate and Project Management Senior Consultant. The webinar will be recorded and will be sent to you within a week. We will take questions at the end of the webinar, so please feel free to type them in the question box as you think of them. Over to you, Howard and Wes.
Thank you and welcome, everybody. This presentation is based on a number of observations that we've had over the years, and I want to list those first, and then we'll go ahead and get started. We've seen that many organizations have a gap between strategy and implementation, that is, between the development of the strategy and the execution of the strategy. Understanding the gap and how to bridge it can help improve organization performance. Project managers can make a unique contribution to bridging that gap, and doing so can be a very good career move for them. And finally, the gap can be reduced if current project managers adopt a more strategic view of what they do, and organization leaders create a high-performance culture and supporting governance and organization structures to enable success. So it's a two-way street. We need project managers, many of whom already think strategically, to create a more strategic environment for them to operate. And we need the leaders in the organization to follow through and create the enabling governance and structures to be able to succeed. We're often struck when we visit organizations about the difference when we're talking with folks at the strategy level and folks at the project management level. Sometimes it seems literally like never the twain shall meet. So let's talk a little bit about the gap between strategy development and strategy execution, and then we'll get into what project managers can do to be more strategic. So we're going to define strategy execution as implementing the organization's strategy by leading and communicating effectively in a climate of teamwork, continuous improvement, innovation, and change. And we like to think of it as building a bridge, literally, between those two different components of performance management. The strategy development side on the left and strategy implementation on the right. In many organizations, there's a gap. And we've looked hard over the 200 some organizations that we have worked with to try and understand that better. And basically, we've observed that there are four major gap areas. One is around communications. Many organizations do not communicate strategy very effectively when it gets down to the business units and the support units, the operations part of the business. We've noticed that the language at strategy and the tools that we use when we develop strategy and do strategic planning are different than the language and tools that project managers use as they implement the strategy. Second category is unaligned people, processes, and systems. We see this a lot in organizations around the world, where folks tend to be somewhat stovepiped in what they do and when they run their operating departments, and there's not good alignment within departments many times, and for sure across business units and support units. Ineffective governance and organizational structure is another one. The roles and the responsibilities, who's responsible for what, how an organization organizes for strategy management and how it organizes for project management. Many times those don't exist at all. There are no offices for that. Folks are sort of left to their own devices to manage the project somewhat in the abstract. And finally, we see a mismatch between human capital capabilities and capacities, skills gaps in the wrong people in the wrong job. So those are the 4 major gap categories. What we're sharing with you today is part of a new course that we have developed that Wes is going to be teaching in Dubai in a couple of weeks in March. It's called Strategic Project Management Professional Certification. We will jointly certify with our partner, the Center for Excellence in Public Leadership at the George Washington University, part of their College of Professional Studies. Wes will be bringing his long knowledge from the Project Management Institute as part of the course teachings. It's a 3-day course, and thank you Informa for offering a very nice discount for folks who are sitting through this webinar and can register using the discount code webinar 200, and we'll show that code again at the end of the session. I'm Howard Rohm, and my co-presenter is Wes Balakian. Between us, we have probably 60 years of experience or more on the strategy side of performance management, project management, and on the project management side of performance management and project management. We've been doing this for about 20 years. We've trained about 18,000 delegates from somewhere over 80 countries, and we are one of 2 organizations in the world that have the dual certifications from the Association for Strategic Planning and the Project Management Institute. We're registered education providers for both of those folks. We teach and train in Arabic and French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Vietnamese, and this is our passion. We do both the training and the consulting to help organizations become more high performance. That's our passion. All right, so what's a project manager? One who contributes to corporate strategy, to the discussions, to the deliberations, someone who manages projects with an eye towards strategy. What are we trying to accomplish? A person who starts with the end in mind. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Someone who puts individual projects in the context of organization performance, the so-called greater good. Someone who coordinates results across department boundaries, business and support units, and a person who understands strategy execution. So let's go back to our bridge between strategy development and strategy implementation and look at what we call the strategy execution imperatives. If we think back to those 4 gap categories that we showed in an earlier version of this slide, what do we do about it? How do we organize an approach to deal effectively and eliminate the gap or reduce the gap so we can, in fact, do a better job of strategy implementation or execution? So the first imperative is engaged leadership. This does not just mean leaders in the C-suite. One of the things that we've observed over the last 20 years is that the ideal organizations, the high-performance organization, create leaders at multiple levels in the organization. As a matter of fact, a tip here, if you're building a management system, make sure that you do it with the different voices from the organization, not just the senior leadership team. The management systems that we've seen stand the test of time, the ones that are most sustainable, are the ones where you look at the change management aspects of leadership as well as the technical parts of the management system. So engaged leadership is a key part of this because those are the folks who are going to create the governance and lead the culture change, that's the transformation that goes on in organizations, and provide the enabling basis for success. So important imperative. On the left, operationalizing strategy. A lot of organizations will end up with a very well-written strategic plan that ends up sitting on the shelf. It has not been turned into operational strategic plans. So that's a key imperative. Another one is the language and tools gap. I mentioned that a little bit earlier. We just talk different languages when we talk with strategy folks and when we talk with project management folks. So how do we bridge the gap between the tools that we use in those two areas and the language that we use? Supported innovation and change culture goes back to engage leadership, but also involves how we set up a management office, a strategy management office, or a project management office. What are the roles, the responsibilities? What are the resources that we give folks in those offices? How do we report performance? How do we aggregate it? How do we organize it? And so on. Capacity, capabilities, and governance. Again, dealing with what we see as many times a skills mismatch with what we're trying to accomplish and the folks who are charged with accomplishing results. Strategic project management is what we're going to talk more about here in just a minute. And then finally, the one in the middle, better alignment between people, processes, and systems. So these are the imperatives that we have identified over the course of the 20 years that we have been working with the Balanced Scorecard Institute and the Strategy Management Group. There's a feedback loop, right? That's the learning and growth piece of this, when we learn from successes on the strategy implementation side, and then feed those back into strategy development during the next planning cycle. We could spend probably a couple of webinars on these imperatives, and we only have a little time today, so we're going to focus on 3 of them. Strategic project management, operationalizing strategy, and then bridging the language and tools gap. One overarching principle that we have found works really well to get organizations thinking in the right way about this is to adopt the mindset from Stephen Covey, to start with the end in mind, one of his habits of highly successful people. And I really like this quote, people and their managers are working so hard to be sure things are done right that they hardly have time to decide if they're doing the right things. Strategy development is about doing the right things, about looking at scenarios, about making choices. And doing things right is keeping the trains running on time, the operating side of the business. And we're looking for balance when we go into an organization to help create higher performance. We need to have a balance on the strategy side and on the operations side. So what are a couple of questions that you can use to get started in the right direction with this? The first one is to ask yourself, what are we trying to accomplish? So many times in organizations, the conversation seems to start around what are we doing? Like somehow that's a strategic discussion, and it's just not. I mean, you have to back up. You have to ask yourself, the higher altitude question, what are we really trying to accomplish in this organization? We'll talk a little more about that in a minute. And the second question is, once we've got our hands around accomplishments, how will we know success when we see it, right? That's the performance measurement question. The question is not what should we measure. The question should be, how will we know success when we see it? And then the next question would be, what are the outcome measures, the output measures, the process measures, the input measures that will support our understanding of success and progress towards success? And then finally, what are the operational strategic projects that are important to what we're trying to accomplish? Most folks don't think like this, we've observed. There's a sort of a rush to judgment to talk about the current projects that we're working on. There's a rush to judgment to get a piece of software that is a promise to make your job easier. We haven't found that those are very effective, not at the start. They come later, but make sure you take time to ask the strategy questions first. To do it well, you need to have some sort of a framework to look at these questions and put them in, put projects in the context of that, the bigger picture. So let's look at one of the imperatives, operationalize strategy. Strategy is a bridge between high altitude, the successful future, the mission, the core values of the organization, and what the business and support units do at the more operational levels, the day-to-day activities that implement the strategy. So strategy is a path and a plan for getting to a successful future. And most importantly, when you think about aligning the organization, taking it down to the level of teams and individuals, folks at the level of the shop floor, the desktop, have a very basic question that needs to be answered and that we as leaders need to address. How do I fit in, and how does what I do matter? So one of the big benefits of thinking strategically is that you get to answer the questions at different levels, right down to the desktop and to the shop floor, and show people how they align to the mission and vision of the organization through strategy. So at each of these different levels, we're going to talk about project management in a slightly different way. When we're at the strategy level, we're going to talk about strategic initiatives. They're still projects, but we differentiate them from operational projects by calling them strategic initiatives. Operational projects are at the business and support unit level, the operational level, and then when we get down to teams and individuals, it's usually projects, activities, and tasks. So the language changes, and we have to understand those differences. There's a lot of different tools that you can use on the strategy side, Blue Ocean and Porter's 5 Forces, OKRs. I've only listed a few of them here. Strategy profiles, if you haven't used that tool, is very powerful. Of course, we have been very active in the balanced scorecard for the last 20 years, building out a framework for helping organizations understand strategy through different perspectives and track what matters, measure what matters. MBOs, of course, Hoshin Conry. We still see an awful lot of organizations in the world that do it the old-fashioned way without using some of these new tools and frameworks. They literally will identify a set of goals. It's usually 8 or 10 or sometimes 12. I call them goal buckets. And then they'll look at the programs and projects, services that they provide, and start putting them into buckets. And I have seen this many times over the course of my career. When they get to the end of this process and there's some extra programs and projects that don't neatly fit in the buckets, what do? Simple, they create more buckets. So we end up essentially trying to justify our existence through the selection of a set of strategic goal buckets. That doesn't work very well. It didn't work very well 20, 30 years ago, and it certainly doesn't work well today. So adopt a framework and make use of common language, and then get your performance organization started using a framework. So strategy we identify as choices. We have to make choices to get from A to B, positioning choices, and then the strategic plan becomes the action, the high-level actions. We've written extensively about it in our book, The Institute Way, which lays out the framework for the balanced scorecard. It's also been translated now into Arabic and Vietnamese. So let's take a look on how these elements are logically connected, and that'll lead us into strategic project management. At high altitude, we have customer and stakeholder needs. We have our mission, which is our purpose. We have our vision, which is a picture of the future. We have perspectives to help us understand strategy through different lenses or different dimensions. We have strategic themes and results, or strategic goals, if you will. Strategic objectives and strategy maps as we're going down in altitude. KPIs, or performance measures and targets. And then finally, strategic initiatives. We get to the strategic projects that help close performance gaps in our strategy. Probably the most important part of this little graphic is the strategic objectives. If you get strategic objectives right in an organization, what my experience is, things just go easier, because there's a lot of things that we will tie to the strategic objectives to help make an organization more higher performing. So if you're going to spend a lot of time on the front end, on the strategy development, spend a lot of that time in the strategic objective part. Initiatives and KPIs, projects, are going to be linked to those strategic objectives. So strategic initiatives are those high-level, enterprise-wide strategic projects that are selected to close a performance gap within the strategic objectives. We'll form a portfolio of those projects that support the strategy and by connection, the mission and vision of the organization. Measures are developed then, providing objective evidence of progress on achieving results from the strategic objectives. We want to use KPIs to measure what's intended to be measured, and the reason we do that is to help inform decision making. We also get a comparison that gauges the degree of performance change over time. So again, reinforcing that strategic objectives are the, literally the DNA of the high performance organization management system. When we get to aligning an organization, we don't do it through measures, we don't do it through initiatives. We will start with the objectives at organization-wide level called Tier 1, and then cascade those down to the operating units, departments, divisions, branches, as cascaded objectives, and then down to personal objectives for teams and individuals. And that way we maintain strategic intent through all the levels of the organization. Many organizations we have found have an awful lot of projects going on. We did some work in Dallas for Susan Komen, the Breast Cancer Foundation, and when we arrived, they had several hundred projects all competing for research and development money. It's very hard to say no to projects that potentially could eradicate a disease like breast cancer. So we are very interested in how can you narrow that list down to a high priority list, an A list, if you will, and the B list and the C list. And one of the ways to do that is with filter the initiatives, the candidate initiatives, to get down to a prioritized set of high priority ones. And when we do that, we can identify special dollars to go against those initiatives to ensure that they're funded as part of the budget formulation process. We would call that StratEx, strategy expenditure money, and that's different than operating OpEx and different than investment CapEx dollars. So the color of the money becomes important when we go to the budget formulation process. So to summarize up here on the strategy side, strategy drives the selection of initiatives at the enterprise level and also projects at the operating level. So if we think of these enterprise-wide, corporate-wide initiatives that are cross-cutting, they have major impact. ERP system is, by definition, a strategic initiative, enterprise-wide implications. But it doesn't have to be necessarily big projects like that. We've seen much smaller projects, training programs where there was serious skill gaps in an organization become strategic. So it's not a hard and fast rule by the size of the project or the number of people it has or the resources and so on. It's very much about closing a performance gap that's identified as part of the strategy development process. And when we get to Tier 2, to business units, those projects tend to be more business unit oriented. Sometimes they'll cross 2 or 3 departments, but they are not as comprehensive, and they're more aimed at solving operational performance gaps. So with that, I'll, Wes, turn it over to you to talk a little bit about the second and third imperatives, starting with language and tools.
Okay, thank you very much, Howard. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. When we talk about a strategic project manager, as Howard mentioned, there is a language. One of the gaps that we have understood over the years is that the language itself does change. So when we look at language from a strategic perspective, we see words like mission, vision, values, KPIs, targets, strategy development, those types of things, which are not necessarily in the everyday vocabulary of the operational side of things or the delivery side. And when I speak to the operational side, I'm referring to the project management side, where we actually take those strategic initiatives and those imperatives and convert those into actionable deliverables. So looking at language of strategy, we see these types of words. When we look at project management, we see a little different language. We see words like risk and agile and project controls and schedule, budget, scope, time, cost, those types of things. And just if you just dissect the language differential between the operational side and the strategy side, you can see that there's already a gap in just the language. So one of the first things that is relatively easy to control in an organization is making sure that that language is understood. So moving from the language, we're going to talk next about the strategic project managements, the link, the strategy, and bridging that gap. So how does an existing project manager become more strategic? One of the things that we'll talk about in the course and go into great detail, as Howard has already mentioned, is making sure that we understand how to start with the end in mind. As was mentioned earlier, many times in the business environment, we go from idea to delivery without stopping to think about how we're going to get this done, number one. Number two, the value associated with that, and making sure it's aligned with the strategy so that we're doing the right things. So rather than just jumping right from idea to delivery, we're gonna try to put together some ways for you to think about that. The next thing we're gonna look at is how to get from where you are now as a project manager, for example, where you're in the delivery mode in the war room and you're fighting fires every day and getting all the projects done, to getting a seat at the table. How do I become more strategic thinking as a project delivery person? So we're going to look at how do I get more strategic in my thought process so that I can get a seat at the table, so that I'm put in front of these types of projects a little bit sooner and I can participate in some of that strategy work. The next thing we're going to do is look at some of those linkages between strategy development and implementation, between projects and portfolios, and the value associated with doing that, as well as aligning those to strategy and understanding what that alignment means, and having the ability to recognize when projects are drifting off center or away from the mean of the strategic intent. The last thing we're going to do is obviously there is a gap. There is no question. In my mind, certainly after many years in project management and working in strategy, certainly with from a strategic perspective, there's definitely a gap, and we're going to try to close that gap and show you ways to become more efficient as a project manager strategically, and to get yourself more strategic thinking and get that seat at the table. So here's a nice little slide, and by the way, this has not been photoshopped. This is an actual picture. We probably won't be telling you where it's from, but this is what happens when strategy is not everybody's job. This is an actual picture. It's not, like I said, photoshopped. When strategy is not understood all the way throughout the entire organization, these are the things that can happen. Now, in this case, Luckily, it's not too much of a big deal, but we certainly don't want to sign our names to this particular project, I don't think, when we see this. So let's talk a minute about project management. I put this slide on here. This could be any project management process, methodology, program, anything at all. But the idea behind this is that you must have some type of program, some type of process in order to deliver projects with a goal in mind. So I just put this one up. This is one that we've done for many organizations over the years. The good thing about this is that doesn't matter what type of organization, doesn't matter what type of things you're doing. This particular one you can apply to just about any organization, any type of industry. It works well in oil and gas. It works well in software. It works well in the medical industry. It doesn't really matter because you can take any of these processes and based on your operating model can move them around to fit how you deliver and what is important to you. The key and the intent of the slide was to communicate that having a process is good, and making sure that the process works for your particular business model and delivery mechanism, so that when you do bring in a strategic project, how do we take that project and plan it properly so it gets executed, delivered, and that the measurements that we put in place for those projects are realized. A little bit about the roles and responsibilities of strategic project managers. Let's talk about that just for a minute. The first one is I'm up in the upper left in the blue box, where we contribute to strategic or strategy reviews. So as the project manager moves upwards towards the strategy side, these are things that they need to look at and understand. How do they get involved with strategic execution? How do they get into strategic operational initiatives? How do they get involved with the goals and the target setting? And the reason behind that is because the more that the project manager understands the goals and what the true targets are of the project, the higher the likelihood of success of those initiatives being executed within the organization. So that's the first thing. And then moving down into the green right side of the screen here, when we start managing strategy execution, we have to start managing strategic resources. And when I say resources, yes, it is certainly monetary or financial, but we also have to manage the people, the equipment, and other things that are that fall under the resource category. We have to manage logistics. We need to monitor and report on our performance so that we can do measurements, periodic measurements throughout the project, and make sure that we are bringing things in on time and as expected. We have to manage and monitor our schedules and milestones. And I want to just stop for just a second and just talk about schedules and milestones because that brings up maybe a question that might be in your mind, and that is, how do I apply strategy execution? Very simply, and I'm used to a waterfall model, but does it work with Agile? Well, certainly it does. As a certified Scrum Master and an Agile certified practitioner, I can tell you that the Agile framework works just as well as the waterfall model or any other type of model that you might be using to deliver your strategic project. So we're not just talking about one methodology of delivery. We're talking about any and all methodologies and getting comfortable using those when we're delivering on strategy. And then, of course, culture and employee dynamics are going to play a role in this. And this could mean there might be a change in the particular culture and environment from which you're working, going from just an execution perspective to a strategic execution perspective. And just that one addition of a word can actually generate some different changes in the organization, organizational change or community transformation, I like to call it. So managing projects strategically. We look at projects and portfolios and how they're managed strategically. We have to look at the prioritization of those projects. Are they aligned to our strategy? Or we're going to use a PMO or an SMO? And what are those roles and responsibilities within the PMO or the SMO? Are we going to have common project prioritization rules? Are we going to look at standard operating procedures? Are we going to, go on using what we've been using, or do we need to change the way we think, the way we approach, and the way we deliver projects? Because now we're thinking about things from a more strategic perspective, and that's a conversation that needs to take place early on. When we're developing our initiatives and we're setting our targets and we're defining what's going to be measured and how it's going to be measured, and we're coming up with our KPIs for our projects. So managing projects strategically is a different way of managing projects altogether. And as Howard mentioned, and we all know, we only have a short amount of time today. And that's why the course is 3 days long, because there's a lot of things to go through and a lot of detail behind all of these simple paragraphs and statements that we're using, and analogies and visualizations to get into some of the details behind this and what does it actually mean? How do I implement it at my organization? What's the value of it for us? And if I'm not doing it, what's the consequences? And ultimately, that's the key. What are the consequences if I don't do it? So I want to go ahead and get to our summary here. I wanted to take and sort of summarize some of the things that we talked about today, and some of the items that are in the course that we'll go over in detail. So thinking about strategic implementation and some of the actions that we have to take as a strategy or a strategic project manager. Certainly one of the things, and these are not listed number 1, 2, 3 for a reason, because they're all of high value and of importance. So certainly we start with stakeholder influence. How do we maintain our stakeholder interaction? How do we maintain stakeholder participation throughout the project life cycle, whether it's a sprint that we're working on for 6 weeks, or whether it's a multi-year power plant that we're installing that's going to solve the energy crisis for half of the country. So how do we maintain stakeholder influence? That's certainly something that we're going to look at and go into great detail. We're going to focus on critical initiatives. How do we decide what's a critical initiative? How do we focus on that? How do we make sure that we maintain that focus throughout the project life cycle? So we're going to look at that. Communications. Communications has to change a little bit when we're talking about strategic project delivery. The clarity in communications helps us, and we'll explain why it helps us and different ways to communicate. The value of communications within an organization's delivery mechanism, and certainly communicating at different levels within the organization, meaning at the C-suite and all the way down to the, as Howard mentioned, the strategy implementation level. How do we keep our leaders or executives engaged throughout the project, throughout the life cycle of those strategic initiatives, why we need them to be engaged, how are we going to integrate change within the organization. That again is back to my point earlier about community transformation. I talked about one little thing about change, but there's a lot of change that's going to take place when we start thinking about ourselves and looking at ourselves as a strategic project manager and an important component of our organization. We need to know the difference between strategy and activity. And that's something that, although it sounds simple, many of us get caught up in being active, but are we actually delivering strategy and actually delivering what we should be doing? Are we focusing on the right things? Are we delivering the right things? Are we looking at the right things? And if not, how do we stop ourselves and say, whoa, we've been doing this for 4 weeks now and we're not getting anywhere. Is this the right thing to be doing? Understanding the difference in capacity and capability. There is a difference, and we'll explain that in detail. Identifying the benefits early, making sure they're tangible, or identifying the tangible and also identifying the intangible benefits. Many times there are intangible benefits to an organization that that come out of doing this, and we'll talk about those and the value of those from an organizational perspective and from an individual's perspective, and what's the value of understanding this. Create measurable benefits, we have to do that, of course. Strategy delivery is just as important as strategy design. So as we look at strategy and we look at designing our own strategy or the organization's strategy, we have to make sure that we're spending the appropriate amount of time in strategic delivery. And the value must not be lost in the deliverables or dates. We got to make sure that we're not just simply what I like to call feeding the software, where we're making sure that we're loading our information into the software tables every day as we should, and we're just working to dates and deliverables. We're actually looking at the value of those projects and should they move forward. So continuing, there's a lot to go, a lot to do in the 3 days. So we use strategy to drive customer satisfaction. We all know the importance of that. What role does risk management play in strategy execution? Risk is going to be an important thing that we're going to look at. We'll spend quite a bit of time on that. I think there's 4 or 5 sections on risk management, risk planning, risk execution, and how do we mitigate some of that risk and different ways to do that. Keeping your organization agile. Obviously, in this day and age, we have to make sure that we're nimble, flexible, and agile enough to keep up, not only with our competition, but with keeping up with technology and other things as well. We need to be people-driven or process-driven. That's what we need to decide. Switching priorities without losing momentum. Sometimes in this fast-paced environment which we work, priorities change, but we can't lose momentum if it's a strategic initiative. So how do we do that? How do we make sure that we keep things going? Managing roadblocks, removing roadblocks, that could say just as easily. What are some ways that we can get that done? We'll talk about that in a couple of sections in the course. Adaptive governance for different delivery models. We're going to look at those types of things and how do we change our governance model for a different delivery model. So this is really, does one size fit all? And I would argue the answer is no. Develop meaningful performance measures. How do we make sure that what we're measuring is meaningful? Staying focused in that changing landscape, and then linking performance to rewards. How do we make sure that we are rewarding the right things for performance? That should take us to our final summary. Howard, you want to take the summary page?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you.
I think the what we want to leave you with here is that there's a role for both the project manager to become more strategic, and a lot of them already are. But the other side of the coin is that the organization has to have various things enabled to be successful to get to high performance. It's not just training project managers to do something. It's an organization culture change in many cases to make that move. But we have to start with a big picture, and this is hard for some folks, especially for some project managers folks who are primarily oriented around around the project. So take a step back and understand the higher altitude strategic elements, themes and strategies and goals and that sort of thing, vision and mission, and start there, and then work down rather than starting at the project level and working up. Strategic objectives are really the hook that makes these management systems work, makes performance measurement work better, makes initiative prioritization better. It gives us a thread, the common thread through the organization that allows us to build out high performance, starting with those strategic objectives. We have to make sure we speak clearly to each other. One of the things that we have done in our training is to adopt a common language, so that when you build out these elements of strategy and initiatives and so on, that we're all talking about the same thing. We've been in organizations where at one level goals mean one thing, and at another level objectives mean the same thing as goals at the other organizational level. I can tell you that if my goal is your objective and we've just started communicating, we already have a problem, because we're speaking a different language. So spend some time getting the language right. Unfortunately, in our profession, the performance management world, there's not universal truth on what words mean, and so this is a key takeaway, is to get the language understood so that leaders understand the project management language and project managers understand the strategy, a little bit of the strategy language. Make sure you use a tool to organize your thinking around strategy and how you align projects to that. We talked about the different approaches to project management, and that's an important part of communicating as well. In Agile, those communications are much more frequent than they are in the waterfall approach, of course, or hybrid approach, but it's just important to get the language right. And then the important linkages between strategy, projects, and portfolios. Make sure that you use a common project prioritization approach. Many organizations, we've observed that they'll use one priority framework at the corporate level and then something different at the department level, and even within the different departments there may be differences in how prioritization is handled. So it's a case where a single approach would make a lot of sense and make it simple for folks. Think about managing the projects with the what are we trying to accomplish question being discussed as frequently as whether the projects themselves are on track, and from a schedule and from a resource adherence point of view. Just keep going back to that question periodically. How you organize, critically important, whether it's a SMO, strategic management office, a project management office, a PMO. We've seen many organizations that combine those. Now they have elements of evaluation, elements of project tracking and target setting, elements of project management, elements of strategy tracking and monitoring in a single office. Of course, the other option is not to put together a single office for that and increase the overhead associated with staffing and running that office, but the functions of that office, when you set up your high performance plan, make sure that you look at the roles and responsibilities and the governance and the structure. And, there isn't just one right answer for this. It really depends on the type of organization and the people in the organization. So just be flexible in your approach to that, but make sure that the elements of it are captured somewhere. And then finally, closing with the strategy execution imperatives. We were only able to talk about 3 of them today: operationalizing strategy, strategic project management, and a little bit about the language and tools gap that exists between the 2 camps, the east side and the west side. But there's other things that are important also, and we'll get to those in some later webinars. I think it's pretty clear that becoming more strategic is a good career move, not just for project managers, but for other folks in an organization. And I know as we've attended various Project Management Institute meetings, we've heard many times over that, the goal for project managers is to make sure they have an opportunity to contribute to the C-suite conversations and move up to the C-suite. So this is a clear motivating incentive for project managers to become more strategic and make a contribution in that area and help the organization achieve higher performance. I think we'll close the technical part of this now and open it up for maybe a few minutes of questions. Once again, if you want to sign up for the course, it'll be in Dubai, and it's 3 to 5 March. Use the discount code. Thank you to Informa for that, and hopefully we will see you there. Wes will be teaching the course, and I look forward to hearing how well that it has gone. Mega, any questions that we
Great.
can tackle?
Yes, thank you very much, Wes and Howard. I will read out some of the questions that have come in. Let's try and answer as many as possible in a span of, say, 10 minutes. So the first question is from Abraham. What is the role of a high leadership level in SPM, and what leadership styles are relevant?
The role of a leadership in a high what? I'm sorry, I didn't get the rest of it. Mega?
What is the role of a high leadership level in SPM, and what leadership styles are relevant?
SPM, what is that? What does the acronym mean?
As in the acronym for the course.
The course, Howard.
Oh, PM, I'm sorry. I thought I heard SBM. Well, I mean, it's, Wes, add in here, please, but, the role of leaders is critical to this, because it's not just dependent on the project manager adopting a more strategic view of the world. It's leadership that creates a climate of transformation so that project management can be successful. I think the hardest part for leaders, or one of the hardest that I've observed, is the ability to say no, and saying no on the basis of some factual analytical framework. And that's where prioritization of the initiatives becomes so important, because we can level the playing field across competing initiatives for limited budget dollars. And when I mentioned the word filter in that initiative slide, that's where the leaders play a key role, is identifying what the criteria are for selection, so that projects move from, one of 150 to, number 1 through 8 on the strategic initiative lists. Most strategic initiatives, when we end up with a balanced scorecard, for example, will have somewhere between half a dozen and a dozen what I call A-list initiatives. And that's as a result of leadership applying a prioritization filter and down selecting to get to the projects that matter the most. And then also using the framework to, to unselect, right? You have to be able to say no. And one way to say no is by using that filter. Wes, you have another thought on that question?
Yeah, I would say that the role of leadership in in a strategic project format like this is to, first of all, stay engaged. Second of all, supportive, obviously, and third, making sure that they're available to remove any roadblocks, stoppages, slowdowns, whatever words you want to use in the course of the project, so that the project can continue and momentum is maintained. So I would say those three things are certainly can be added to, and we could talk about that at length. But certainly those three things are important from a leadership perspective. Anyway, and that's what they should be doing.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you for that. Let's move on to the next question. Karen would like to know, instead of having project management and strategy terms, what about having one set of terms? And how do you bridge this gap?
I guess we, we started to set that up, didn't we, with the difference between language and tools. I'll share with you that when we created those two slides a month or two ago, we were somewhat taken aback by how many different words are used in each of the two camps. And so how do you bridge a language gap like that? Well, you have to be able to sit at the same table, don't you, to have conversations around that. And understanding takes some time. What happens in a lot of organizations, they don't take the time to work with each other because the levels tend to be very different. You know, the C-suite deal with their issues, and the project managers deal with their issues. So that's why we're encouraging more coordination between the two different camps, if you will, so that a common language can be developed. You know, when I talk about a project, do I mean a strategic project or do I mean an operational project? If they're both aligned to strategy, does it matter? Maybe they're just, supporting projects to our strategy. So I think there's a lot of work to be done here. I haven't solved that problem yet, but I was somewhat taken aback by all the different terms that the two sides use to describe what they do every day.
Yeah, I was going to say, just to add to that, I think first of all, what the question has done is validated what Howard and I have believed for many years to be a gap in the business world, is that there is a gap, and it's been recognized as a gap. And to ask why isn't there one is the question we asked. So that's why we felt compelled to put together this certification, is to start to be able to talk to people, share with them the knowledge that we've accumulated over the years, the same things that we've seen within organization after organization, and then try to put together this type of a scenario, this type of a course, so that we can then begin developing strategic project managers, so there is just one language. So I thank you for the question, and I appreciate the validation.
I'll add one thing. I think this is going to be just as hard as it is at either of the levels, where just trying to get a common use of words. I know we did a lot of work with the Association for Strategic Planning when we wrote the body of knowledge for the certification examinations there. And just within the room, there were 24 of us pioneers who wrote that. Just within the room, the difference in goal and objective and strategy and even performance measurement was notable. And so it's going to take time to find that common language, if it's even possible, frankly. I mean, look how long we've been doing this on the management, on the strategy side of it, and we still don't have a universal set of words. So I think in the interim, what we can do is find ways to communicate with each other more frequently, rather than separate the project management from strategy development. Just find some common ways to talk about the things that are important to both of them.
Okay, great. Let's take one last question, please. Vasant would like to know, to manage a project strategically, Does one have to be a specialist in the balanced scorecard and project management?
No,
No,
not
I
at
agree.
all. That's why I showed a whole group of models. We happen to believe that the balanced scorecard is a very universal, large framework that you can do a lot of other things in. Project management can fit within that. Baldrige can fit within that. EFQ can fit within that. So the balanced scorecard is a very good framework, and one that is successfully used worldwide in all sorts of different sectors and all different size organizations. But it certainly is not the only framework that you can use. I think what's more important is how you connect things. We could call it the Wes Balakian framework. It's not so much what you call it, it's how you think about things and how you connect the different elements that exist at different altitudes to create, literally a language in an organization that people will rally around and support, so that everybody is talking about the same thing at the same altitude. So, don't get hung up on one framework. It's much more important about what the components of that framework are, and do they stand alone, but do they also connect? So many times we have seen strategic plans where there is no framework. There's a series of strategic goals, and then there's some initiatives tied to them, and then they just throw some performance measures in there. There's absolutely no connection between those things. It's like they're done by different people in different rooms and then just brought together in a slick looking report. So that's why strategic thinking matters so much. And what we're trying to do as a company, as an institute, is to try and institute the the concept of thinking about these things and then logically connecting them, so we can have clear communications about what we're trying to accomplish, and then what are the projects and programs we're going to use to do that, and then how do we measure that success along the way, and then make adjustments as we go so that we learn and grow.
Yeah. To add to that, from the project side, Prince 2, the Project Management Institute, the international standards, ISO standards, agile, hybrid, waterfall. I can go on for 20 minutes. It really doesn't matter what process you're using. All I advocate is that you decide on a process and that you use a process, but you don't need to be an expert in any of those to do what we're trying to, we're sharing with you today. And from the strategic side, again, back to what Howard said, and to close out with that you just need to have a common language. You just need to have a good understanding of what we're trying to accomplish. Make sure that we have the executive support, and we can move forward together.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much. I think we're kind of running out of time now, but thanks a lot. If anyone else has any more questions, please feel free to email Informa or get in touch with Howard, and we'll be all happy to help you. So yeah, we'd like to come to the end of this webinar. Thank you for listening in. We really hope you found this webinar informative and useful. So yeah, like I said, get in touch with us if you have any questions. And as Wes and Howard mentioned, the next step to advance your learning is to attend the Strategic Project Manager SPM certification course coming up early next month. So we look forward to welcoming you at the course. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Megan.
Thanks,
everybody.
Yep, thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you.